The shovel hit metal with a sharp clang that echoed through the abandoned rail yard. Margaret's German shepherd, Luna, had been digging frantically at this exact spot for 3 days straight, her powerful paws sending dirt flying in desperate arcs. What the dog unearthed made Margaret's breath catch in her throat, a corner of what appeared to be a military-grade metal container, its surface bearing the faded insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division. If you're already getting chills from this discovery, hit that subscribe button and comment where you're watching from, because this story is about to take you on a ride you'll never forget. And don't forget to smash that hype button. The rusted train car that had become the town's favorite joke sat like a monument to failure on the overgrown tracks behind Margaret's inherited property. For 6 months, neighbors had whispered and pointed, their laughter carrying on the wind whenever the 34-year-old veteran walked past their pristine suburban lawns. "Look at the war hero with her $1 million inheritance," they'd sneer, not knowing that Margaret's grandfather's will had specified this particular piece of seemingly worthless railroad equipment for reasons no one could fathom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the broken windows of the 1940s freight car, its red paint peeling like dried blood. Weeds had grown up through the floorboards, and raccoons had made nests in the corners where hobos once slept. The local real estate agent had valued it at exactly nothing, a liability he'd called it, something that would cost more to remove than it was worth. But Luna knew better. The dog's behavior had changed the moment they'd moved onto the property. Instead of her usual playful demeanor, she'd become obsessed with this one section of earth, approximately 10 feet from the train car's rear coupling. Her whining had kept Margaret awake for nights, a sound that reminded her too much of the military working dogs she'd handled in Afghanistan, the ones who could smell danger, long before humans could see it. Now, as Margaret knelt beside the partially exposed container, her hands trembling as she brushed away centuries of accumulated soil, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The metal wasn't just old, it was deliberately buried. Someone had taken great care to hide this, and recently. The dirt above it had been disturbed and carefully replaced, probably within the last few decades. Luna sat back on her haunches, her intelligent brown eyes fixed on Margaret's face, tail wagging with an urgency that seemed to say, "I told you so." But what Margaret couldn't have known was that 3 houses down, behind drawn curtains, someone was watching through binoculars. Someone who had been waiting 47 years for this exact moment. The container was larger than Margaret had initially thought. As she and Luna worked together, the dog's claws surprisingly effective at loosening packed earth, the outline of a military footlocker emerged, roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. The kind used to transport sensitive materials during wartime, the kind that wasn't supposed to exist in a civilian's backyard. Margaret's training kicked in automatically. She photographed everything before disturbing it further, noting the position, the depth, the condition of the surrounding soil. Old habits from evidence collection in combat zones, where a mishandled discovery could mean the difference between life and death for an entire unit. The lock had long since corroded away, leaving only the metal hasp hanging loose like a broken promise. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be military-grade waterproof canvas, were items that made Margaret's pulse quicken, stacks of documents, photographs, and what looked like official correspondence bearing letterheads she recognized from her own service. But it was the photograph on top that stopped her cold. Her grandfather, Thomas Hartwell, stood in full dress uniform beside a train, this train, shaking hands with a man in a suit she didn't recognize. The date stamped on the back read September 15th, 1952. Her grandfather would have been 28 then, just returned from Korea, officially discharged and supposedly working as a railroad mechanic. Except the documents beneath the photograph told a different story entirely. Margaret's hands shook as she read the first page. Operation Paperclip, Asset Transfer Authorization, Classification Level, Cosmic. Words that shouldn't exist in her grandfather's possession. Words that belonged to the highest levels of government secrecy, the kind that people disappeared for knowing. Luna suddenly stood alert, her ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Someone was coming up the gravel driveway, footsteps too deliberate to be casual, too quiet to be friendly. Margaret quickly rewrapped the documents and lowered the container back into its hole, her military instincts screaming that she was in immediate danger. Through the train car's broken window, she could see a figure approaching, elderly, walking with a cane but moving with the purposeful gait of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The man stopped just outside the train car and called out in a voice that carried the weight of decades. "Miss Hartwell, I believe it's time we had a conversation about what your grandfather really did during the war. Are you feeling that tension building? Comment danger if you think Margaret should run, or stay if she should face whatever's coming, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about this story." The man's name was Vincent Kowalski, and the moment he spoke, Margaret recognized the accent, the same careful pronunciation her grandfather had used when he thought no one was listening. Eastern European, softened by decades in America, but never quite erased. He stood at the edge of her property line, respecting boundaries in a way that suggested military training, his weathered hands resting on a walking stick that looked more like a weapon than a mobility aid. "Your dog found what I've been looking for since 1978, he said, his pale blue eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "The question is, Miss Hartwell, do you understand what you've stumbled into?" Luna remained tense beside Margaret, but her growl had subsided to a watchful silence. The dog's instincts were conflicted. This man posed a threat, but not the kind that required immediate action. Margaret had learned to trust Luna's judgment in Afghanistan, where the difference between friend and enemy often came down to subtle behavioral cues that only the dogs could detect. "You knew my grandfather," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "I worked with him." Kowalski stepped closer, and Margaret noticed the slight bulge beneath his jacket. Armed, but not aggressively so. Thomas was, how do you say, a patriot with a conscience, a dangerous combination in our line of work. The documents in the buried container suddenly took on new weight. Operation Paperclip. Margaret knew enough military history to recognize the name. The program that brought Nazi scientists to America after World War II, trading expertise for immunity. But her grandfather had been a simple railroad mechanic, hadn't he? "He wasn't simple anything," Kowalski said, as if reading her thoughts. Thomas Hartwell was one of 12 men tasked with transporting assets across the country. Scientists, documents, technology that your government decided was too valuable to leave in European hands. That train car behind you, it carried some of the most dangerous minds of the 20th century. Margaret's mouth went dry. "What kind of assets?" "The kind that built your space program, the kind that won the Cold War." Kowalski's expression darkened. "And the kind that, in the wrong hands, could still destroy everything your grandfather died protecting." A car engine rumbled in the distance, growing closer. Kowalski's head snapped toward the sound, his entire demeanor shifting from cautious ally to hunted prey. "They've found us," he whispered, grabbing Margaret's arm with surprising strength. "Listen carefully. Your grandfather didn't just transport these people. He documented everything. Names, locations, what they were working on. Insurance, he called it. Evidence that certain powerful people would kill to keep buried. The black sedan that rounded the corner moved too slowly, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun like dead eyes. Margaret's combat instincts screamed danger as the vehicle stopped just outside her property line, engine running. "The container," Kowalski urged. "Where is it?" Margaret hesitated. Trust was a luxury she'd learned not to afford strangers, no matter how convincing their stories. But Luna made the decision for her, moving protectively between Margaret and the approaching car, her hackles raised in a way that meant immediate threat. "Still buried," Margaret said. "What do they want?" "To finish what they started 47 years ago." Kowalski's voice carried the weight of decades-old fear. "Your grandfather was supposed to die in a car accident in 1978. When he survived, they decided to wait. Patience is a virtue in our business. They knew eventually someone would come looking for what he hid." The sedan's doors opened simultaneously, and two figures emerged, a man and woman in dark suits, moving with the coordinated precision of a tactical team. They weren't here for conversation. Margaret's mind raced through her options. The train car offered cover, but no escape route. The house was too far. The woods behind the property provided concealment, but left Luna vulnerable in the open ground between. "There's a reason he left you this place," Kowalski said urgently. "Thomas knew you'd have the skills to finish what he started, but first, you have to survive the next 5 minutes." The woman approached with her hands visible but ready, the kind of tactical positioning Margaret recognized from close protection details. Professional, lethal, and absolutely certain of her superiority. Her partner flanked wide, cutting off the most obvious escape route toward the tree line. "Miss Hartwell," the woman called out, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to compliance. "We're with the Department of Historical Preservation. We understand you've made some discoveries on your property that may be of national significance." Margaret almost laughed. Historical preservation didn't travel in pairs, didn't wear tactical boots, and certainly didn't approach civilians like they were enemy combatants. But she played along, buying time while her mind catalogued defensive positions and potential weapons. "I haven't found anything worth preserving," Margaret replied, stepping slightly behind the train car's bulk. Luna moved with her, maintaining protective positioning without being obvious about it. "Your dog seems to disagree." The man had circled far enough to have a clear line of sight to the disturbed earth where Luna had been digging. German Shepherds have excellent noses for historical artifacts. Kowalski had melted into the shadows beside the train car with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime avoiding detection. Margaret caught a glimpse of him gesturing toward the rear of the property, an escape route she hadn't considered. "Mr. Kowalski," the woman continued, apparently aware of his presence despite his concealment. "It's been a long time. We were sorry to hear about Prague." The old man's sharp intake of breath told Margaret everything she needed to know about Prague. Whatever had happened there, it hadn't been pleasant. 30 years, Kowalski replied, stepping back into view with his hands raised in mock surrender. "I thought you people had forgotten about me." "We never forget, just like we never forgot about Thomas Hartwell's insurance policy." The woman's smile was winter cold. "Did you really think a car accident would stop us permanently?" Margaret's blood chilled. They were talking about her grandfather's death, as if they'd orchestrated it. The official report had listed mechanical failure, brake lines corroded by road salt, a tragic but common accident for a man who'd spent his life working with machinery. "He lived 13 more years after your first attempt," Kowalski said. "Long enough to make sure his granddaughter would inherit more than just a rusty train car." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her grandfather hadn't left her this property out of sentiment. He'd left her a responsibility, a burden that came with skills he'd somehow known she would develop. Military training, combat experience, the ability to recognize and respond to threats. Luna's low growl intensified as the male agent began moving closer to the excavation site. Margaret could see him calculating distances, angles, the tactical advantages of controlling the high ground near the train car. "The documents your grandfather collected," the woman continued, "contain information that could destabilize international relationships built over decades. Names of people who are now in positions of significant power, details about programs that officially never existed." "And you want them back," Margaret said. "We want them destroyed, along with anyone who's seen them." The threat was delivered with bureaucratic pleasantness, but Margaret had heard similar words in interrogation rooms overseas. The tone that meant negotiation was over, that violence was not just possible, but inevitable. Kowalski caught her eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward something behind the train car, a signal she didn't understand, but knew was important. "There's just one problem with your plan," Margaret said, buying precious seconds while she tried to decode Kowalski's message. "You're assuming I found something worth killing for." The woman's expression shifted, professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the predator beneath. "Miss Hartwell, we've been monitoring this property for 6 months. We know exactly when your dog started digging, exactly where, and exactly what she found. The only question now is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or whether we'll need to be more persuasive." Behind her, Margaret heard the soft scrape of metal against metal, a sound that shouldn't exist in an abandoned rail yard, but somehow felt familiar like a half-remembered melody from childhood. The train car was moving. The movement was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the train car's position, barely perceptible except for the way shadows fell differently across the ground. But Margaret's trained eye caught what the agents missed. The rear coupling had disengaged, and the car was rolling backward on a grade so gentle it was almost invisible. Kowalski's weathered face showed the faintest hint of satisfaction. "Your grandfather was always clever with mechanical things," he murmured. just loud enough for Margaret to hear. 47 years, and the counterweight system still works. The female agent spun toward the sound, her hand moving instinctively toward her concealed weapon, but the train car's momentum was already building. What had started as an imperceptible roll was becoming a genuine threat. 30 tons of steel moving with the inexorable force of gravity and engineering. "Move," the male agent shouted, but his partner was already diving sideways, her tactical coordination disrupted by the unexpected variable. Margaret didn't waste the opportunity. She grabbed Luna's collar and sprinted toward the tree line, using the train car's bulk as cover, while the agent scrambled to avoid being crushed. Behind her, she could hear Kowalski's labored breathing as he followed, his cane clicking against the gravel with surprising speed. "The workshop," he called out between gasps, "behind the oak grove." Margaret had explored every inch of her inherited property during the past 6 months, but she'd never noticed a workshop. The oak grove was dense enough to hide a building, especially if someone had designed it to remain invisible from casual observation. The sound of the train car's collision with the buffer stop echoed across the property like thunder, followed immediately by shouting voices and the slam of car doors. More agents, Margaret realized. The sedan had been just the advance team. Luna bounded ahead through the underbrush, her powerful frame cutting through brambles and fallen branches with the efficiency of a creature bred for exactly this kind of terrain. Margaret followed, her own military conditioning keeping pace despite the burning in her lungs. The workshop materialized out of the shadows like something from a fever dream. A concrete bunker disguised as a maintenance shed, its entrance hidden behind a carefully cultivated wall of ivy and wild roses. Kowalski produced a key from somewhere inside his jacket, his hands shaking as he worked the lock. "Thomas built this in 1953, he explained, as the heavy door swung open. Back when he realized that some secrets were too dangerous to trust to governments. The interior was a time capsule from the Cold War era. Radio equipment, filing cabinets, and a workbench covered with mechanical devices Margaret didn't recognize. But it was the wall of photographs that made her stop breathing. Dozens of faces stared back at her, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes, all connected by red string in a pattern that looked like a conspiracy theorist's nightmare. At the center, larger than the rest, was a photograph of a man she'd seen in history books, Wernher von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist who'd become the father of America's space program. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists to America, Kowalski said, moving to a filing cabinet and producing a thick folder. "Your grandfather transported 47 of them, but he also documented something the government didn't want documented, what they were really working on after they arrived." Margaret studied the photographs more closely. Some faces were marked with red X's, others with question marks. A few had dates written beneath them, death dates, she realized. They weren't just building rockets, she said. Rockets were the public face, the acceptable science. Kowalski opened the folder, revealing documents that made the buried container look like a child's treasure chest. But some of these men had been working on projects that made the atomic bomb look like a firecracker, biological weapons, mind control, technologies that could reshape human consciousness itself. Luna's ears pricked up, voices outside getting closer. The agents had found their trail. "Your grandfather discovered that 12 of the scientists weren't working for the American government at all," Kowalski continued urgently. "They were still working for their original masters, using American resources to complete projects that had been interrupted by Germany's surrender." Margaret's mind reeled. A sleeper cell. Inside the space program. Inside everything. NASA, the Pentagon, major corporations. They've been playing a game that's lasted 70 years, and they're very close to winning. The sound of breaking branches was getting closer. Margaret estimated they had maybe 2 minutes before the workshop was discovered. "What did my grandfather want me to do with this?" Kowalski smiled grimly and pointed to a device on the workbench, something that looked like a radio but was clearly much more sophisticated. "He wanted you to broadcast it. All of it. Every name, every document, every piece of evidence, but not just to the media or the government. They're all compromised. He built a system that could reach every emergency frequency in North America simultaneously." "A dead man's switch," Margaret breathed. activated by a specific sequence that only someone with your military communications training would recognize. Kowalski handed her a small device that looked like a garage door opener. But Margaret, once you press that button, there's no going back. These people have been killing to protect this secret for decades. They won't stop with you. Through the workshop's single window, Margaret could see flashlight beams cutting through the gathering dusk. Luna pressed against her leg, a warm reminder that some loyalties transcended politics and conspiracy. The choice was simple, really. Live quietly with a terrible secret, or risk everything to expose a truth that could reshape history. Margaret looked at the photographs on the wall, faces of men who'd escaped justice, who'd built new lives on American soil while their victims molded in unmarked graves across Europe. Her grandfather had spent 47 years waiting for someone with the courage to finish what he'd started. The first flashlight beam swept across the workshop's camouflaged entrance just as Margaret made her decision. Her finger hovered over the activation button, but Kowalski's weathered hand stopped her. "Wait," he whispered. "There's something else you need to know." Outside, she could hear the agents communicating in the clipped, efficient language of a coordinated search. They were professionals, but they were also operating in unfamiliar terrain at dusk, advantages that wouldn't last long. "Your grandfather didn't just document the conspiracy," Kowalski continued, his voice barely audible. "He infiltrated it. For 13 years after the supposed car accident, he fed information to a network of people like me, survivors, witnesses, people who refused to let history be rewritten by the victors." Margaret's finger remained poised over the button. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that broadcast system isn't just going to expose them. It's going to activate sleeper agents in 12 countries, people who've been waiting decades for the signal to release everything they know about Operation Paperclip and its successor programs." The weight of responsibility settled on Margaret's shoulders like a physical force. This wasn't just about her grandfather's secret anymore. This was about a coordinated revelation that could topple governments, destroy careers, and potentially destabilize the entire post-war order. Luna's low growl indicated the searchers were getting closer. Through the window, Margaret could see at least 4 figures moving through the oak grove with military precision. "How many people will die if I press this button?" she asked. Kowalski's expression was grim. "Fewer than will die if you don't." "You're right there with Margaret, aren't you? Feeling the weight of that impossible choice? Comment press it if you think she should activate the broadcast, or wait if she needs more information, because what she decides in the next 30 seconds will determine whether the truth finally comes to light or stays buried forever." A new sound cut through the night, helicopter rotors, distant but approaching fast. Margaret's military experience told her everything she needed to know about the escalation. This had moved beyond a simple retrieval operation. They were preparing for a siege. "There's a tunnel," Kowalski said, moving to what looked like a solid wall, but proved to be a cleverly disguised door. "It leads to the old mine shaft about half a mile north. Your grandfather was thorough." Margaret looked at the broadcast device, then at the tunnel entrance, then at Luna's intelligent eyes. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, sitting perfectly still while her human made a choice that would echo through history. "If I activate this, what happens to you?" "I've been dead for 30 years, Miss Hartwell. Prague, remember? This is just me finally getting around to lying down." The helicopter was close enough now that its searchlight was beginning to sweep the tree line. Margaret could see the beam cutting through branches, methodically eliminating hiding places. She thought about her grandfather, working alone for decades to document a conspiracy so vast it seemed impossible. She thought about the scientists in the photographs, living comfortable lives while their victims remained nameless. She thought about the agents outside, so certain of their authority that they'd threatened to kill an American veteran on American soil. Margaret pressed the button. The device emitted a single, high-pitched tone that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then silence. "That's it?" she asked. Kowalski was already moving toward the tunnel, his cane abandoned in favor of speed. "That's everything. In approximately 4 minutes, emergency broadcasts will begin on every frequency from Mexico to Canada. Radio, television, internet, emergency alert systems. Everything your grandfather could hack, hijack, or infiltrate." The workshop door exploded inward, just as Margaret and Luna reached the tunnel entrance. The female agent from earlier stood silhouetted against the night, her weapon drawn but not yet aimed. "Miss Hartwell," she called out, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "You have no idea what you've just done." "I know exactly what I've done," Margaret replied, one hand on Luna's collar, the other on the tunnel door. "I've finished my grandfather's work." The agent's radio crackled to life. Urgent voices reporting emergency broadcasts beginning across the continent, communication systems compromised, containment protocols failing. For the first time since this began, the woman looked uncertain. "You can't stop it now," Kowalski said from the tunnel entrance. 70 years of secrets, all going public simultaneously. Your employers are about to discover what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried. Margaret took one last look at the workshop, at the photographs, the documents, the evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped the modern world. Then she followed Kowalski into the darkness, Luna padding silently beside her. Behind them, she could hear the agent speaking rapidly into her radio, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of a mission that had just become impossible. The tunnel stretched ahead into blackness, but for the first time in 6 months, Margaret felt like she was moving toward the light. The tunnel was older than Margaret had expected, carved stone rather than concrete, with support beams that bore the marks of 19th century craftsmanship. Her grandfather hadn't built this escape route, he'd simply discovered and improved upon something that had existed for generations. The beam from her phone's flashlight revealed rusted mining equipment and the remnants of narrow-gauge railroad tracks, evidence of the coal operations that had once honeycombed this entire region. Luna moved ahead with the confidence of a creature whose senses extended far beyond human limitations. The dog's breathing was steady, controlled, but Margaret could feel the tension in her companion's muscles, ready for action despite the apparent safety of their underground refuge. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded to nothing. Either the agents hadn't discovered the tunnel entrance, or they were smart enough to know that following armed suspects into an unknown underground maze was a tactical nightmare. "How far?" Margaret asked, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Half a mile to the main shaft," Kowalski replied, his breathing labored but determined. "But we're not going there. Your grandfather built something better." The old man led them through a series of branching passages that seemed to follow no logical pattern. Margaret's military training screamed warnings about getting lost in unfamiliar terrain, but Kowalski moved with the certainty of someone who'd traveled this route many times before. They emerged into a larger chamber that had clearly been modified for human habitation. Battery-powered lights activated automatically as they entered, revealing a space that was part bunker, part communications center, part museum of Cold War paranoia. "Welcome to Thomas Hartwell's real workshop," Kowalski said. The walls were lined with radio equipment, computer terminals that looked decades ahead of their time, and filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. But it was the bank of monitors that dominated the center of the room, each one displaying a different news feed, all of them carrying the same story. Emergency broadcasts were indeed going out across North America, but they weren't the chaotic data dump Margaret had expected. Instead, each revelation was carefully timed, professionally presented, and backed by documentation so comprehensive that denial would be impossible. "He planned this for 47 years, she breathed. "Every detail. Every contingency. Your grandfather understood that the truth isn't just about having evidence, it's about presenting that evidence in a way that can't be ignored, discredited, or buried." On the screens, Margaret watched as news anchors struggled to process information that rewrote everything they thought they knew about the post-war period. Names were being named, documents were being displayed, and the carefully constructed mythology of Operation Paperclip was crumbling in real time. But it was the international feeds that showed the real scope of her grandfather's network. Simultaneous broadcasts in 12 languages, coordinated releases of classified documents, and testimony from survivors who had been waiting decades for this moment. "Prague," Margaret said, understanding finally dawning. "You weren't the only one." Kowalski nodded grimly. 37 of us, scattered across the globe. All of us with pieces of the puzzle, all of us waiting for the signal to put those pieces together. Luna had found something that interested her near one of the filing cabinets, a metal box that looked similar to the one they'd buried in the yard, but smaller, more personal. "Your grandfather's final message," Kowalski said, noticing the dog's interest. He recorded it the day before he died, said it was for the granddaughter he'd never met, but somehow knew would finish his work. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the box. Inside was a small recording device and a letter, written in her grandfather's careful handwriting. The letter was brief, but every word carried the weight of a lifetime's dedication to an impossible task. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then the truth is finally coming to light. You've inherited more than property. You've inherited a responsibility that I couldn't fulfill alone." The men in those photographs lived comfortable lives while their victims remained silent. That silence ends today. You have the skills I never had, the training, the courage, and most importantly, the moral clarity to see this through to the end. But remember, exposing the truth is only the beginning. Making sure it matters, making sure it changes things, that's the real work. The broadcast will create chaos. Use that chaos wisely. The people who've been protecting these secrets for 70 years won't surrender easily. They'll try to discredit, to deflect, to make this about anything other than justice for the dead. Don't let them. Your loving grandfather, Thomas Hartwell P.S. Luna's bloodline goes back to the dogs we used during the war. She knows things that can't be taught. Trust her instincts. Margaret looked at Luna with new understanding. The dog's obsessive digging, her protective behavior, her ability to sense threats. It wasn't just training. It was genetics, generations of breeding for intelligence and loyalty that had been passed down like a family heirloom. The monitors showed that the story was spreading beyond news feeds now. Social media was exploding with hashtags, citizen journalists were connecting dots, and government officials were being forced to respond to questions they'd hoped never to face. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. Kowalski smiled for the first time since she'd met him. "Now we watch the world change, and we make sure it changes in the right direction." But even as he spoke, Margaret could see new feeds appearing on the monitors, official statements, damage control, the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a massive disinformation campaign designed to muddy the waters and protect the guilty. The truth was out, but the battle for what that truth meant was just beginning. The first counterattack came within hours, swift and sophisticated, in a way that demonstrated just how prepared Margaret's enemies had been for this possibility. News feeds began reporting technical difficulties with emergency broadcast systems, suggesting that the revelations were the result of a coordinated cyber attack by foreign agents seeking to destabilize American institutions. Margaret watched from the underground command center as carefully crafted narratives began to emerge across multiple media platforms. The documents were being dismissed as elaborate forgeries, the testimonies discredited as the ravings of elderly conspiracy theorists, and the entire operation reframed as an assault on national security rather than an exposure of historical crimes. "They're good," Kowalski admitted, his weathered face grim as he monitored the developing spin campaign. 70 years of practice at controlling information flow, but your grandfather anticipated this too. He led Margaret to a bank of servers she hadn't noticed before, their quiet humming filling the underground chamber with electronic life. "Phase 2, he explained, his fingers dancing across a keyboard with surprising agility. The documents that went out in the first wave were just the appetizer. The real evidence, the stuff that can't be dismissed or explained away, that's what we're releasing now. The screens filled with new information, financial records showing payments to Nazi scientists decades after the war ended, medical experiments conducted on unwitting American subjects, and most damning of all, correspondence between high-ranking government officials discussing the deliberate cover-up of war crimes. But it was the video footage that changed everything. Grainy black-and-white film from the 1950s showed men Margaret recognized from the workshop photographs conducting experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. The subjects were clearly American citizens, soldiers, prisoners, mental patients, people who had trusted their government to protect them. "How did my grandfather get this?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He didn't just transport the scientists," Kowalski replied. "He documented everything they did after they arrived, hidden cameras, audio recordings, copies of every report they filed. Thomas understood that someday someone would need proof that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay. Luna pressed against Margaret's leg, sensing her distress. The dog's warm presence was a reminder that some loyalties transcended the ugly complexities of human politics. The media response to the second wave was markedly different. The video evidence was too clear, too well documented to dismiss as forgery. News anchors who had been skeptical hours earlier were now calling for congressional investigations. International allies were demanding explanations. The carefully constructed narrative of patriotic necessity was crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Impressive work, Miss Hartwell. But you should know that some secrets are kept secret for good reasons. Check the news from Denver." She switched to a Denver news feed and felt her blood turn to ice. A military convoy was moving through the city streets, and the reporter was describing it as a response to credible terrorist threats related to the ongoing information warfare campaign. "Martial law," she breathed. Kowalski nodded grimly. "They're going to frame this as a national security emergency. Suspend civil liberties, control the flow of information, arrest anyone who tries to spread the truth further." But even as he spoke, new feeds were appearing on the monitors: international news organizations, foreign governments, human rights groups. The story had spread beyond American borders, beyond the reach of domestic damage control. "Your grandfather was smarter than they gave him credit for," Kowalski said with something approaching pride. "He didn't just plan for American resistance. He planned for global accountability." Margaret watched as the story continued to evolve, each new revelation building on the last, creating a momentum that seemed impossible to stop. But she also saw the human cost beginning to mount. Scientists named in the documents were reportedly receiving death threats. Government officials were resigning in disgrace, and the families of victims were finally learning the truth about loved ones who had disappeared decades earlier. "How many people are going to die because of what we've done?" she asked. "How many people died because of what they did?" Kowalski countered. "Margaret, this isn't about revenge. It's about justice. And sometimes justice is messy." Luna's ears pricked up suddenly, her body tensing in a way that Margaret had learned to recognize as a warning. Someone was approaching the underground facility. Multiple someones, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. "They found us," Margaret said. Kowalski was already moving toward another section of the chamber, revealing equipment that Margaret hadn't noticed before: weapons, communication gear, and what looked like enough supplies to withstand a siege. "Your grandfather prepared for this too," he said, handing her a military-grade rifle that felt familiar in her hands. "The question is, are you prepared to finish what you started?" Through hidden cameras positioned around the mine entrance, Margaret could see figures in tactical gear setting up a perimeter. They weren't taking any chances this time. This was a full-scale assault designed to eliminate the source of the leaks permanently. But as Margaret checked her weapon and prepared for what might be her final battle, she realized that it didn't matter whether she survived the next few hours. The truth was already out there, spreading like wildfire across a world that had been waiting 70 years for this moment. Her grandfather's work was complete. Now it was up to others to decide what to do with the legacy he'd left behind. The assault began at dawn with a precision that spoke of extensive planning and unlimited resources. Margaret watched through the hidden cameras as tactical teams rappelled into the mine shaft from helicopters, their movements coordinated with the efficiency of a military operation that had been rehearsed dozens of times. But her grandfather had planned for this too. "Pressure plates," Kowalski explained, as the first team triggered a series of non-lethal but highly effective deterrents: smoke grenades, strobe lights, and audio devices that filled the tunnels with disorienting noise. Thomas wasn't trying to kill anyone. He just wanted to buy time. The time was being well used above ground. Margaret could see on the monitors that the story had reached a tipping point where suppression was no longer possible. International courts were announcing investigations. Allied governments were demanding explanations, and most importantly, families of victims were coming forward with their own evidence. Documents, photographs, and testimonies that had been hidden for decades. "It's working," Margaret breathed, watching as a survivor of medical experiments gave testimony to a congressional committee that had been hastily convened to address the crisis. People are finally listening. But the tactical teams were adapting to her grandfather's defenses, using equipment that suggested they'd studied his methods extensively. Gas masks negated the smoke, night vision defeated the strobes, and sound dampeners reduced the audio assault to manageable levels. Luna positioned herself between Margaret and the tunnel entrance, her intelligent eyes fixed on threats that human senses couldn't yet detect. The dog's breeding showed in moments like this, generations of selection for courage, loyalty, and the ability to protect her human companions against overwhelming odds. "There's one more thing," Kowalski said, moving to a control panel that Margaret hadn't seen him use before. "Your grandfather's final contingency. If they managed to reach this chamber, if they were about to capture or kill the people responsible for the broadcast," he gestured to a device that looked like a more sophisticated version of the activation button Margaret had pressed hours earlier. "A second broadcast?" she asked. "The names and locations of every person who's been protecting this conspiracy for 70 years. Not just the scientists, the politicians, the businessmen, the intelligence officers who've been covering this up across multiple administrations. Your grandfather called it the nuclear option." Margaret stared at the device, understanding the implications. The first broadcast had exposed historical crimes and long-dead perpetrators. This would destroy living people, many of whom might have inherited their roles rather than chosen them, many of whom might be trying to make amends for their predecessors' sins. "How many innocent people would be caught in that blast radius?" she asked. "How many innocent people have been caught in the blast radius of their silence?" Kowalski countered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Margaret, I've spent 30 years waiting for this moment. But I'm old and I'm tired, and maybe I'm not the best person to make this choice anymore." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels, multiple teams, moving with increasing confidence as they overcame each defensive measure. Margaret estimated they had maybe 10 minutes before the chamber was breached. Luna's growl deepened, and Margaret could see through the cameras that the lead team had reached the final checkpoint before the main chamber. They were professionals, but they were also operating under orders that probably included eliminating everyone in the facility. "There's a third option," Margaret said suddenly, her military training providing a solution that civilian thinking might have missed. "We surrender." Kowalski stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "They'll kill us the moment we step outside. Not if we're broadcasting live while we do it." Margaret pointed to the communication equipment that had been sending the revelations around the world. "Every major news organization on the planet is watching this story. If we surrender publicly, if we make ourselves visible, they can't just make us disappear." It was a calculated risk based on the assumption that even the most ruthless conspiracy had limits when operating under global scrutiny. Margaret had seen similar dynamics in combat zones, the difference between what people would do in darkness versus what they would do under the bright lights of international attention. Kowalski considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your grandfather would have liked that solution, justice through transparency rather than revenge through destruction." Margaret activated the live broadcast system, knowing that within seconds her face would be visible to millions of people around the world. Luna sat beside her, the dog's presence a reminder that some bonds transcended the ugly complexities of human politics. "My name is Margaret Hartwell," she said to the camera, her voice steady despite the approaching footsteps. "I'm a United States Army veteran, and I'm about to surrender to federal agents who have been trying to suppress evidence of war crimes committed on American soil. If something happens to me in the next few minutes, if I have an accident or resist arrest, you'll know why." The tactical team reached the chamber entrance just as Margaret finished speaking. The lead agent, the same woman who had threatened her at the train car, stood in the doorway with her weapon drawn, but not aimed. "Miss Hartwell," she said, and Margaret could hear something different in her voice now. Uncertainty, the recognition that the rules of engagement had changed fundamentally. "You need to come with us." "I know," Margaret replied, standing slowly with her hands visible. "But first I want you to know that the whole world is watching." The agent glanced at the cameras, at the monitors showing global news coverage, at the evidence that this operation had moved far beyond the realm of deniable actions. For the first time since this began, Margaret saw doubt in the woman's eyes. The arrest was conducted with a professionalism that bordered on theatre, each movement carefully calculated for the cameras that were broadcasting the scene to a global audience. Margaret was handcuffed with unnecessary gentleness, read rights that everyone knew were meaningless in this context, and escorted through the tunnels with a courtesy that felt surreal after hours of mortal threat. Luna was allowed to follow, a concession that spoke volumes about how dramatically the situation had changed. No one wanted to be seen on international television separating a veteran from her service dog, especially when that veteran had just exposed one of the largest cover-ups in modern history. Above ground, the scene was chaos, managed by professionals who were clearly improvising. News vans lined the access road, helicopters circled overhead, and protesters had somehow materialized despite the remote location. Margaret's surrender had become a media event that no amount of government spin could control, but it was the faces in the crowd that told the real story. Elderly men and women holding photographs of relatives who had disappeared decades earlier. Families of soldiers who had volunteered for medical experiments they didn't understand. Survivors of programs that had officially never existed. The truth had given them permission to speak, and they were using that permission with the force of suppressed grief finally finding its voice. "Miss Hartwell," a reporter called out as Margaret was led toward a waiting vehicle, "do you have any regrets about what you've done?" Margaret paused, looking back at the mine entrance where her grandfather's life's work had finally reached fruition. "My only regret is that it took 70 years for the truth to come out." The agent escorting her, the same woman who had threatened her life hours earlier, leaned close enough to whisper, "For what it's worth, some of us have been waiting for this day too." The admission was small, but it suggested fractures within the conspiracy that Margaret's grandfather had probably anticipated. Not everyone who had inherited this secret had been comfortable keeping it. "What do you think happens next? Comment justice if you believe the truth will finally prevail, or cover up if you think they'll find a way to bury this story too, because the next few days will determine whether 70 years of silence finally ends." The drive to the federal facility was conducted in a convoy that moved through crowds of supporters and protesters, past news crews from around the world, under the scrutiny of social media that was documenting every moment. Margaret realized that her grandfather had understood something fundamental about the modern world, that secrets could only survive in darkness, and that sufficient light could make even the most powerful conspiracies impossible to maintain. At the facility, she was processed with the efficiency that suggested her captors were still trying to figure out what to do with her. The charges were vague: terrorism, espionage, violations of national security, but everyone involved seemed to understand that these were placeholder accusations, while lawyers and politicians figured out how to handle a situation that had spiraled far beyond their control. Kowalski was in the cell next to hers, looking older but somehow more peaceful than he had in the underground chamber. 30 years, he said through the bars. 30 years I've been waiting to sleep without nightmares. Is it over? Margaret asked. The cover-up. Yes, the consequences, those are just beginning. Through the small window in her cell, Margaret could see protesters maintaining a vigil outside the facility, signs demanding justice, families seeking answers, veterans supporting one of their own. The story had become larger than any individual, larger than any government's ability to control. Luna had been allowed to stay with her, another concession to public opinion that demonstrated how completely the power dynamic had shifted. The dog lay beside Margaret's cot, her presence a reminder that some loyalties transcended the complexities of human politics. 3 days later, Margaret was released without charges. The legal justification was procedural: insufficient evidence, jurisdictional issues, constitutional concerns. But everyone understood the real reason. Prosecuting her would require a trial, and a trial would mean more revelations, more testimony, more opportunities for the truth to spread. The world she emerged into was different from the one she'd left. Congressional hearings were ongoing, international courts were issuing warrants, and most importantly, the families of victims were finally getting answers they'd been seeking for decades. Margaret returned to her property to find the train car had been designated a historical landmark. The workshop had become a museum, and Luna's digging site was marked with a plaque honoring the victims of Operation Paperclip and its successor programs. Standing in the place where it all began, watching visitors learn about her grandfather's courage and sacrifice, Margaret finally understood what he'd really left her. Not just evidence of a conspiracy, but proof that one person with enough determination could change the world. Luna sat beside her, tail wagging, as if to say, "Good job." Grandpa would be proud. The truth, Margaret realized, was like her grandfather's train car. It might look worthless and abandoned, but it carried the power to transport people to places they never imagined they could go. Sometimes the most important inheritances aren't the ones that make us rich. They're the ones that make us brave. What legacy are you carrying forward? Share this story if you believe that truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to surface. And remember, the most ordinary-looking things sometimes contain the most extraordinary secrets.